Hi, I'm Rob Cosman. Welcome to my shop. I want to deal with 5 plane issues, that's P-L-A-N-E, that seem to come up quite frequently. Either I post a video and somebody comments, or I'm teaching and somebody has the question, but they cycle such that I'm going to give you my opinion of them. Take it for what it's worth. The first one has to do with sharpening. Do you use a jig, or can you do it freehand? And I've had disagreements with friends of mine who are professional woodworkers who say you can't teach the average person to freehand sharpen. I beg to differ. I'll show you that. Second issue is, do you need to leave your plane sitting like this, or should it be sitting on its side? Third issue is, when you plane and run the plane over the board, should you lift it up and carry it back here each time, or is it okay to simply drag it back? Does it dull the blade? Obviously, you just got the answer to one of them. Fourth issue is waxing the sole. Is it going to cause a problem? Is it going to create an issue when it comes to finishing? And the fifth issue is using the Charlesworth ruler trick, which I would defend to the grave because I actually think it's the best system, and I'll explain that one as well. So since we need the plane sharp in order to do this, we'll start off with the sharpening. I'm using a Wood River 5.5, which I think is probably the best overall plane as a first. Get a screwdriver that fits this. Okay. Now, this is a simple jig, and it's designed to clamp on the side of the blade. So you would set it in like such, tighten it up, and then instead of relying on any skill, you simply let that little roller rest on the stone and you move this forth and back until you get a sharp edge. Now I have a friend that has come up with various jigs in order to set that in the same position every time so that you're not constantly altering the bevel. And that's fine if you need it, but let me show you how simple this is. I have 2 stones. Actually, I always have my coarse stone on the left and my fine stone on the right. I use a 1000 grit stone to start with. This is a trend diamond plate. I like it because it stays flat, it lasts a long time, and the opposite side is a 300 grit side that I actually use to keep my second stone or my finishing stone flat. This is a Sharpen glass stone, a 16,000 grit. Gives you a fantastic edge, but it wears with use, so you have to keep flattening it. And I just spend 3 or 4 seconds rubbing the 300 grit side on the stone just before every use. Now, do the 300 grit scratches matter? No. Even though the 300 grit stone is going to leave 300 grit scratches on the 16,000 grit stone, it's not the scratches that do the cutting in the steel, it's those 16,000 grit particles. So there's no worries there. I actually use a product called Hone Right to lubricate it, which just helps deal with rust issues. So you take your blade, that's your primary bevel, which is typically going to be 25 degrees. And it's on a thick blade, and that's the nice thing about today's planes, is most of them are coming with thick blades. This is an IBC replacement blade, and it's a full 140 thousandths of an inch thick, so that's even thicker than the stock blade. Set that down on the primary bevel, and you can rock it a little bit until you feel it. Once you feel it, recognize that you don't have to polish all of that bevel just at the leading edge. So once I find that primary bevel, I raise it up just a few degrees and then lock that by locking my wrist and my elbow and my elbows, and then pivoting from my shoulder in a little circular motion. Now this would be more typical of the speed that I actually would use, and I'll do that for about 10 seconds. And I'm done when I can detect a slight burr on the back side of the blade that runs corner to corner. So when I can pick up a burr and I can feel that going corner to corner, I'm done. There's no reason to do any more, unless you had a really bad nick. And in that case, you've got to get that burr to go below where the nick is, or else you go plain and you'll still have that nick visible. Now, once I've left the 1000, I come over to the 16,000. I'm going to do the exact same thing, except after registering on the primary bevel, instead of raising up 1 or 2 degrees, or maybe 3 or 4, depending on whatever it is, that you did over here, on this stone, you've got to come up just a little bit higher. so that you're just above that previous angle. So you're working on just the leading edge. And I'll spend about 10 seconds on this one. Now, this stone wears with use. So instead of staying in one spot, I'll slowly rock heel and toe, covering the entire stone surface. Evens out the wear. It's more life out of the stone. And after about 10 seconds of work on here, just before I finish, I'm going to put downward pressure in one corner for 3 seconds by pushing down with an index finger on my right hand. And then I flip and I do the same thing on the other corner using the pinky on my left hand. Now, that's easy to do. In fact, when we teach it, we actually just start off using one stone. You can get a decent edge just off the 1000 grit, and it's only one procedure as opposed to two. So I start my students, we go in, we do what I just showed you on the 1000, and then we remove the burr and we go right to work. Well, everybody can do that, and once they realize that, later in the day we come back and say, okay, now let's take this up a notch, and we come over to the 16,000, adding in that second, or in this case a third bevel, and that just makes the edge that much better. It's easy to do. All right, so myth number one, or I shouldn't say myth number one. Issue number one, do you need a sharpening jig? No, you can learn to do this freehand. It's not difficult. By the way, my sharpening station I keep low, just above knee height. Why? If you try to do this at bench height, and you have your stone up here, you're pivoting mostly from the wrist, if not the wrist, the elbow. And it's very difficult to do these little circles and at the same time move out over the stone. And most folks can't do it. What I discovered is if you keep it down here, by leaning over the stone, you're pivoting from way up here in your shoulder. You can leave the wrist and the elbow locked, much easier to do. And then to cover the entire stone, instead of having to do two motions at the same time, you can simply rock with your feet, heel and toe, while you're doing this controlled motion of holding that angle to do that bevel. And it seems to work. Folks are able to do it. All right, that's just my opinion. Try it, see. Now, for years, what we would do when it came to the preparation of the back of a blade, we would go in and we would first flatten all of this surface. Now, you didn't purposely flatten all of this, but in order to flatten out here, you had to do a fair bit of this entire back of the blade. Once you flattened it, then you would then work through the various grits to increase the level of polish. A blade cutting edge can only be as good as the lesser of the two surfaces. The bevel and the back are the two surfaces that create the edge. If you polish one and ignore the other, your edge is only going to be as good as the one you ignored. Well, so you'd walk through the various grits and you would end up getting this whole surface really shiny and smooth, but you're only using out here. Well, for the same reason that we elevate the blade to produce micro bevels on the bevel side, David Charlesworth developed this technique whereby you take a little thin steel rule, and by setting it on the edge of the stone, you're now laying the blade down on its back, and it's elevated. It's less than 1 degree, but by working on the opposite 1/4 inch edge, delivering even pressure with 3 fingers, spend just a few seconds to deburr. But what you've essentially done is created a micro bevel on the back that, because of the nature of your setup, is flat. It's less than 1 degree, so it's not going to change the geometry of the cut, but you've avoided having to polish all of this. Instead, you're just dealing with a little wee tiny strip right out there. Saves so much time. So, that's my opinion on the back bevel. Kudos to David Charlesworth. He's the one that developed it. All right, now let's get this in the plane and make it work. By the way, I keep my blade, could add that one to the mix too, but we'll deal with that some other time. I keep my blade about 1/32 of an inch away from the cutting edge. Now make sure the face of the frog doesn't have any debris on it. So when you put that blade in there, it lays nice and flat. Put the lever cap on with enough pressure that it won't allow the blade to move accidentally, but at the same time you don't want so much pressure that you can't make adjustments. Up against a light colored background, wipe one way by the way, get rid of all the debris on there. You want that blade to be parallel to the sole. If it isn't, you've got to use your lateral adjustment lever to get it that way. And then once it is, I'm going to retract the blade, Pull it all the way in, and as it just disappears, you can make any final adjustment to get that as close to being parallel as possible. A little bit of wax in the sole. Now, let me address that one a little bit later. But I've got the blade fully retracted, and I'm going to start planing. Now, if I'm dealing with a component to a piece of furniture, and a lot of times I like to build and assemble right from the plane, no sanding. If I can avoid it, I do. So if I've got a component that's already been dimensioned, it's already been fit to the piece, I can't afford to change the dimension a lot. But I want to give it that final finish. So if I were to start planing with the blade out what I would call an undetermined amount, and it accidentally, without realizing it, it's been out too far and now I've got taking off a big chunk, I'm in trouble. So instead, and the reason why I prefer this style of plane, while planing I can start to spin the adjuster knob. That's this brass knob down underneath. I do it with my index finger. And as I start to plane, I can see where the shaving is coming out. If it's in the middle of the blade, then it's right. If it's off to one side or the other, I need to make a slight adjustment, but it allows me to sneak up and take the lightest of shavings without fear of seriously changing the dimension of the piece. Now, you'll notice when I plane, I'm just doing this to show off, I typically would keep my thumb right here in the middle, just behind the knob, use this part of my index finger to run along the board to keep the board in the center of the blade. But you'll notice that when I plane, I don't lift the plane up, I just drag it back like so. Now, why do I do that? Number one, this thing is heavy. I don't have to be lifting that thing up every time. And every time you set it back down, you risk jarring the blade and moving it one side or the other. It's not a huge risk, but risk nonetheless. This way, it's a nice smooth motion. I can get into the rhythm of it. And of course, the criticism is, well, you're dulling the blade. Well, you're dragging it back on a piece of wood, big deal. And if you were to shorten the life by 10%, it takes me about 30 seconds to sharpen. So I'll take the inconvenience of having to sharpen one time more than I would otherwise in the run of a day than if I were to lift this up and carry it back each time. So that's my argument. I don't think it's a big deal at all. Now, how do I set it down? I set it down just the same way I use it. Here's my defense of that. You can set it down this way, but you're more likely to have the blade go askew by jarring it with a more than a gentle drop down like that than you are to have it move forward, especially if you typically, well, I'll just leave it at that. You're more likely to have it skew sideways if you set it down like that than you are if you were to drop it down like this. That's not that much of an argument, but it is one. If you leave it like that, you do have the blade exposed, and my bench is clean for when we shoot a video, but typically there's 100 items on here, and you're far more likely to bump something against that blade with it sitting like that. If you're sitting it down like that, it's sitting on a wooden bench. Is it going to dull the blade? Not hardly. There is the argument that if somebody comes along and moves it like that, it may cut into the bench, and I've actually done that before. But out of convenience and of use, when I'm using the plane, I prefer to set it down the same way I use it. When I'm ready, I pick it up again, and I go right back to work. I've talked to numerous people, and there's probably as many that agree as there are that disagree. Do whatever you want. It's your plane, it's your bench. But to try to say that it makes any difference one way or the other, it's a tough argument to make. At least it is with me. Now, what was the final thing? Oh yeah, the wax. People often ask, is this going to interfere with the finish by having wax on there? Well, the advantage of the wax is that it cuts the friction between the sole of the plane and the wood substantially. So my effort is now spent pushing the blade through the wood instead of pushing the plane over the wood. And for that reason, I'll run a little bit of a risk. However, if, as I had mentioned to you, I was dealing with a furniture component and I was just about to get rid of that last little bit of pencil marks, fingerprints, whatever, I'm not going to wax the sole under that circumstance. But during the process, any little bit of residue is going to come off. And to be honest, I've never had fish eyes, is what they call them, when some kind of a substance on the wood will cause the finish that you're applying to react differently. I've never dealt with it, so my answer to that question is No, it's not going to affect the surface, but again, as a precaution, I wouldn't do it on the last stroke. You cover all 5?
Yes, we did, man.
All right, comment. Let me know what you think. Always open to an argument. Have a good day.